NASA-TLX. Have you ever felt overwhelmed, stressed, or pressured to complete a task? Have you ever wondered if that task could be easier, less stressful, or manageable? In order to enhance task performance, one must first become aware of the underlying contributing factors or sources that influence the workload of a task. The NASA-TLX is one method designed to do just this. It aims to enhance task safety and performance. This training program will outline the key components of the NASA-TLX and how to use it. Here is a list of topics that we will cover in this training program. If at any time during one of the training videos should you have the need to stop the video momentarily, you may pause it and return to it when you are ready to continue. This training program will look to answer the following questions. What is mental workload in the context of human factors research? How do you measure mental workload? Why is mental workload important, or why should it be considered? What is the NASA-TLX and what does it do? When do you use the NASA-TLX? How do you use the NASA-TLX? And is the NASA-TLX effective and reliable? NASA-TLX. What is it? The NASA-TLX is one of the most widely known tools for assessing subjective workload. Since its introduction, NASA-TLX has been translated into more than a dozen languages and applied to a variety of fields. It is also considered the gold standard for subjective mental workload measurement. Why does it exist? If people were able to accomplish everything they were expected to do in a work setting, the concept for assessing mental workload would have little importance. Since they often cannot, designers, manufacturers, and managers who are ultimately interested in system performance will use the NASA-TLX to assess subject mental workload. For this reason, the NASA-TLX consists of 6 subscales that represent somewhat independent variables: mental, physical, and temporal demands, frustration, effort, and performance. These categories are used to help determine subject mental workload. The 6 subscales. In order to effectively assess mental workload for a task, we have to measure the various components of the task and of the individual performing the task. It is important to consider a few things about how each subscale relates to rating mental workload, its subjective importance as a source of loading for that type of task, and its magnitude in a particular example of the task. The following information is also taken into account when examining the 6 subscales: its sensitivity to differences between tasks, sensitivity to experimental manipulations within tasks, association with subjective ratings of overall workload, its independence from the other factors, and subjective importance to the raters. There are 3 broad categories for the scales to be categorized under. They are task-related skills, behavior-related skills, and subject-related skills. The task-related scales. These are used to measure the objective demands of the task. They include physical demands, mental demands, and temporal demands. It is believed that having separate scales for physical and mental demands for a task are more effective in the accuracy of workload measurement as opposed to keeping one single task demand scale. Physical demands, as the name implies, represent the physical components of a task, whether it be pushing a button or operating with heavy machinery. This is an important factor to mental workload, although it might not seem like it, but physical demands require mental processing, which in turn can have a varying degree of influence on the mental workload depending on the physical components required. When the physical and mental demands are paired in a task, there is a risk for detrimental effects on an individual's ability to complete the task. Mental demands apply to the cognitive demands of the task or the required level of mental processing. The more mentally challenging a task is, means there is a greater risk of negative effects on mental workload, such as compromises in the task performance or an increased potential for errors. Temporal demands relate to the effects of time constraints or time pressures from a task, like meeting a certain quota or completing a specific number of procedures in a given time period. This scale is included for reasons similar to the previous two. A task with greater temporal demands can influence the cognitive processing and functioning of an individual with the potential to lead to poorer performance. Now think back to that situation from the beginning of the training program and the task you had to accomplish. Are you able to picture any of these components in your task? These three factors represent the most common ways that workload differences are manipulated across a broad range of activities, but they do not represent the cost of achieving task requirements for the individual or how successful an individual was in doing so. The behavior-related scales. These are used to reflect an individual's subjective evaluation of the task. They include own performance and effort. Own performance represents an individual's self-perception of how they did on the task. Although there is a high chance for bias and poor reliability in measuring someone's rating of their own performance, when paired with the rest of the rating scales in combination, it can give the most insight into the subjective measure of mental workload for a task. The effort scale includes both the mental thinking side and physical labor side of a task as rated by the individual. It combines both mental and physical effort into one scale. By having one universal scale for effort, the between-subject variability can be reduced. Rating effort adds an essential dimension to the measure of mental workload, as an individual who perceives a task to involve more effort will undergo more mental processing and in turn be subjected to a higher mental workload. The subject-related scales. These are used to include the psychological impact on the individual. Frustration is included in the process of mental workload measurement because the psychological effect of a task will indirectly affect the cognitive abilities of the individual and the task performance. Usually, a higher level of frustration can lead to distractions or adverse effects on the individual's level of attention, critical thinking ability, emotional state, and physical performance. It provides information about how comfortable an individual felt about their effectiveness of their efforts relative to the magnitude of the task demands imposed on them. This is an image of the 6 subscales with their associated descriptions. After going through these scales, you can see that the NASA-TLX is an effective method for measuring mental workload. It is also clear that these scales are fairly general in their definition, but at the same time, they can be applied to any number of work situations. What is important to remember is that although the NASA-TLX covers a variety of workload sources for a task, you must be mindful of the fact that not all situations will include all 6 scales. They might only have 4 or 5 that fully relate to the task you are interested in examining. For example, some tasks are influenced more under time pressure, while others may involve more physical demand and effort. This is an image of the paper-based version of the NASA-TLX. As you can see, each subscale has its own rating scale with marking indicators ranging from very low to very high. Please take a few minutes and try the following example. The following are tasks that a pilot would perform for a standard flight. Rate them from highest to lowest for their mental workload. Here are the actual ratings for the tasks. How did you measure up? In-air maneuvering came first, followed by on-ground maneuvering, then landing, and finally takeoff. Provided alongside each task is an actual rating of mental workload provided by a NASA-TLX measurement on a scale of 0 to 100. This marks the end of the introduction to the NASA-TLX. When you are ready, please continue with the remainder of the training program.